Ladies and gentlemen, before I begin, actually, I'm going to correct our esteemed organizer. You seem to be conflating David Steele and Laurie Rensselaer, because Laurie was a PhD student at Chicago, and David was a PhD student at Hull, and eventually he was awarded a PhD on the basis of the book.
Corrected, I'm glad.
But anyway, okay, ladies and gentlemen, let us begin by defining the word socialism. Despite what people may tell you, and despite what Wikipedia may tell you, Karl Marx did not distinguish satisfactorily between socialism and communism. Insofar as he talked about socialism and communism, he used the words interchangeably to describe a future which was characterized by the complete absence of private property and the complete absence of a market, right? It was a later generation of Marxists who distinguished between the two concepts. For Stalin, socialism was state ownership of the means of production and still some reliance on markets of a sort. You had a labour market and so on. And communism was the later and final stage, characterized by the abolition of private property and the market, and that was some way in the future. So what Marx interchangeably called socialism and communism became communism in the 20th century, with socialism as a prior concept, as a prior stage, I should say. And also it ought to be said, just clarify this for people, is that socialism often refers to a welfare state with or without large-scale nationalisation of industry. And after the Second World War, in Europe, you had a lot of welfare states, some like Sweden, which actually did not nationalise industry for the most part. You think of Volvo Cars, it was a privately owned organisation. In Britain, they went in for the commanding heights of the economy. This is, if you like, a bit of a Marxist influence there. And they nationalised coal and steel and transport and gas, electric and so on, which were eventually denationalised under Thatcher. But socialism can mean different things to different people. And I mean, one could be far more subtle than what I'm saying at the moment. But I want to just make it quite clear that when we're talking about, when Mises talks about the problem of economic calculation in the socialist commonwealth, he's talking about the future, the millennium ahead, right? Okay, where which is characterised by the absence of private property and the absence of the market, right? And the word socialism is often used rather in a weakened, watered down sense in the 20th century, and also over here when people accuse people of being Obama of being a socialist, right? Okay, Obama has never proposed the abolition of private property and the market economy. He has an interest in private property, right? And he makes sure that the privileges go to certain people in the private economy. So, you know, we've got to be very careful what we mean. But for Mises, though, remember, Mises is writing in the 1920s, and we're coming out of the 19th century, right? Marx dies in 1883, 2 years, by the way, after Mises is born. Their lives overlap by 2 years. Anyway, so Marx dies in 1883, and then, of course, Marxism is, you know, a powerful force, intellectual force, and it heavily influences socialist parties in Europe, right? Okay? And there was always an element that was Marxist in the Labour Party, although in Britain, there was surprisingly little influence, actually, compared with, say, Germany, where the Socialist Party of Germany had a big Marxist element, right? Okay, and they were far more adhering to Marx, or what they thought was Marx. So when Mises is writing in his famous article in 1920, that was where he stated the argument, and then he included it in his masterwork, Socialism and Economic and Sociological Analysis in 1922, right? That's the book which Patrick was talking about. Okay, he's gunning for socialism as Marxists understand it at that time, where it was coming out of Marx, right? Okay, coming out of Marx. What we might say, communism stroke socialism. In fact, David, when he started writing this book in the 70s, and I'll tell you more about this later, and a little outfit with which I was connected called Libertarian Press was going to publish this, and then we never did. But he hadn't written the whole thing at that time, and we were going to call it the impossibility of communism, right? Thinking of communism as being, Marxian communism, right? Which would also, of course, mean what Stalin meant by communism, which is this millennium where there is no private property and no market, right? It would be the impossibility of communism. And, of course, the problem with saying the impossibility of communism, particularly in the United States, is, well, it's not impossible. We've got the Soviet Union, right? So clearly that wasn't really going to work as a title. And I mean, it might more have worked in Britain, but even there people are going to say, well, of course there's communism, right? It's not impossible. We've got it, right? It's the Soviet Union, right? They've got their weapons trained at us. So consequently, that's why the book was then rechanged. It was changed, the title, from Marx to Mises, Post-Capitalist Society and the Challenge of Economic Calculation. And rather coyly, David on the back tells us that he was a native in Edinburgh, Scotland. He was born in Scotland, but he grew up in Birmingham, England, graduated in sociology from the University of Hull. Subsequently, he got his PhD on the basis of this book. Steele is now editorial director of a publishing house in Chicago, a little bit coy, because it's the publishing house that published the book. Anyway, and he's since then published other books by him. David was a journalist. He left school at 16. He was a journalist. He tells me that the first time he ever encountered a telephone, this is Britain, remember, and the standard of living wasn't as high in Britain then as it is now, and he didn't have I had many friends who didn't have phones in their home, and David came from quite a poor background and didn't have a phone in his home. And the first time when the phone went at work, right, when he was a journalist, a trainee journalist on a local Birmingham newspaper, the phone rang and he wasn't quite sure what to do. He picks it up and what do we do? I remember him telling me that story. Anyway, so he was 16 in 1960 when he left school and got a job as a trainee journalist. And then later on, he became a mature student at the University of Hull he went up in 68, I think, so that would make him 22 when he went to college. That's really quite rare, particularly in Britain at that time, for people to actually go back to college in their 20s. There were places that were set up for that. Birkbeck College, London, Ruskin College, Oxford, and other universities would take people, but there's far fewer people would be going back to university in their 20s and 30s, and that's more common now. Anyway, David went to university finally when he was 22. Or was he 20? Maybe he was 20, 66, 68. Anyway, and he got a bachelor's degree, right, in sociology, in fact. And then he was a good student, very good writer, by the way. He writes very, very well. And he then was going to get his PhD. So that when I knew him, he was working on his PhD, and it was going to be, he was a Marxist, right, socialist, right, as Marxists call themselves, right, they call themselves socialists, right, even if the word socialist means lots of different things to different people, as I'll explain. And he was going to write a book about Marx, right, about Marx's Das Kapital. And he's one of the few people, because there's a lot of Marxists who've never read Das Kapital, I can tell you. But anyway, he'd read Das Kapital, he'd read twice, right, for all three volumes, all three turgid volumes, which was something I have no plans ever to do in the rest of my life. Anyway, so that's Das Kapital. He'd read Das Kapital, he's reading it through again, all right, so that was what he was going to write his thesis on. Anyway, so let's go back a little bit to 1920. This evening I have in mind Ludwig Mises' argument about the impossibility of rational economic calculation in what he calls a socialist commonwealth. Let me be quite precise what Patrick mentioned and what I mentioned. In other words, is it possible to calculate rationally in a society where there is no institution of private property and there are no markets? Markets turn on private property, right? Private property enables you to trade, and in the process of trade, prices emerge, right? The whole emphasis is the undesigned order, right? The spontaneous order of the market, right? Okay, so that's the question. Now, for Marx and Engels, they didn't really pay very much attention to this question, actually, of how the whole system is going to function. And in fact, something I'm going to tell you about in a minute, there's a passage by Engels which is just ludicrous actually as to how this thing could work. It will all be hours of labour, right? Okay, hours of labour, and that would enable us to solve the problem. I mean, nobody now would really think that you could solve the problem. No Marxist would think now you could solve the problem in that way. Now, I don't want to be too harsh on Marx and Engels, because after all, Marx and Engels did write a lot of stuff about a lot of topics, and I think there is actually some merit in some of the things they talked about. But certainly, their strong point was not how markets function. Let's put it like that. Let's be kind. We'll be charitable this evening. After a couple of glasses of wine, we'll be charitable. Mises argued that if monetary calculation is to be employed in directing production, two conditions must hold. These are a market in higher order goods, in other words in capital goods, and a universally employed medium of exchange, meaning money. Right? So the crucial point is a market in capital goods. And that gives rise then, if you like, to capitalism. It's actually not a phrase I'm particularly keen on. It's got a lot of other connotations to it. So I don't go around saying I'm a capitalist, or even I'm a anarcho-capitalist. I'm not keen on the word. But in the sense of capitalism meaning a market in capital goods, then yes, that is a necessary for a modern society that's characterised by division of labour. And that's what Mises argued. Now, you could say, well, you could have barter, right? We don't have money, we have this market in capital goods, but it's all bartered. But the problem is, of course, the barter can only really function on a very, very limited basis, right? Because we're talking about thousands. I mean, it's not just like what's the price of steel and what's the price of concrete. It's what's the price of 50 different sorts of screw, right? Or 500 different sorts of screw. All of which are capital goods, right? All of which are capital goods. And when we say capital goods, what we mean, and higher order goods are in contrast to first order goods, which are consumer goods, alright? That's the distinction that's being made. So consumer goods are things like the chair and the glass of wine and so on, right? The higher order goods are the capital and the land and the labour that goes into making the wine, right? And that goes into making the machinery with which you harvest the grapes. So you have this huge structure of production, right? Austrians are very good on structure of production. We won't go there now. But that's what we mean by the capital market. Mises actually said that you could avoid, I mean, he didn't recommend this, of course, because having a market in consumer goods is actually more efficient. But he thought you could actually you could avoid having a market in consumer goods. But what you couldn't avoid doing was having a market in capital goods, right? And first order goods. And that means that means not just capital, right? But and every sort of capital, every sort of intermediate product, every sort of raw material, but also the prices of land, different sorts of land that's suitable for cultivating grapes, lands that's suitable for building, right? And labour, all the different sorts of labour that go into making goods, right? Okay, so you had to have markets in that. And there's no way those markets could function without money. There's no way they could function because there's so many products, there's millions and millions of products, right, which are these intermediate products that go into making consumer goods, and that therefore you need to have, right? You need to have money, right? There's no way in which barter could suffice. So those are the two minimally necessary conditions for rational economic calculation, according to Mises, right? Now, Mises, okay, these up till then there have been a lot of people who were sympathetic to the market, who were hostile to socialism and Marxism. Remember, at that time, Marxism and socialism, right? Okay, they tend to be equated. Anyway, and they felt the need to reply. But you know, the arguments would tend to be in terms of incentives. If you don't pay people, they won't produce. Now, there may be a considerable amount of truth in that. But that was the nature of the sort of arguments that were sketched at that time. They really didn't grapple with the inherent impossibility of calculation, of rational economic calculation, in a sophisticated society characterised by the extreme division of labour and exchange, which is what Europe and North America, and for that matter the whole world in a way, right, was engaged on in, say, 1914, or even as early as 1850, or even as early as 1800, right? Okay, you go further back. very sophisticated networks of exchange. And so we have this incentive argument, which I don't want to dismiss entirely, but that doesn't really get to the grips with it. And in fact, there were a number of people who sort of began to sort of talk about these things. And actually a Dutchman called Nicholas G. Pearson in 1902 really got to the point about this is prior to Mises actually, really got to the argument about the role of value and how could you possibly calculate value in a socialist commonwealth, right? The problem is, however, it was a more like a sort of a scattergun approach. Oh, well, here, what about this? What about that? What about this? It was Mises in 1920 who put it all together and expounded it satisfactorily, right? So that's the credit for Mises. Not that Mises was the first person to come up with these ideas entirely, but it was Mises the first to put it all together and to expound it as one coherent argument in an article in 1920, which wasn't translated. This is part of the problem with the reception of Austrian economics in the 20th century. These people are writing in German and they don't get translated into English. After all, Menger's first book wasn't translated into English until 1950 or 51, right? That was written in 1871. Wasn't available. Mises' 1920 article was translated as one of several articles in the on collectivist economic planning put together by Hayek in 1935, which also included Pearson's article and included Mises. And then in 1936, Robbins got his friend or fellow student Kahane, K-A-H-A-N-E, to translate socialism. And that came out by Cape in 1936 and came out over here, I think, Harcourt Brace. Anyway, but so these things often take a long time to get into the English language. It's one reason why English-speaking economists, right, often don't really engage with the Austrian arguments. In fact, there's a footnote. What's the time? Footnote, okay, here is that Keynes reviews Theory of Money and Credit in the Economic Journal in 1913-14, right? The book came out in German in 1912, and it wasn't translated until many, many years later into English. So Keynes, who's a very smart guy, don't misunderstand me, is reviewing it when it comes out in the Economic Journal the following year. And the story I'd heard was he didn't actually read German, or I guess he spoke a little bit of German. I mean, he's an educated guy, and so on, but that he couldn't really get to grips with a detailed book in German. And I read the review, right, and it struck me that I don't know if this is true, the story, to be honest, but it struck me, though, that he could have written this review without having read the whole of the book. Right? So the way the review is written, right? The way he dismisses him, he doesn't really engage with Mises. It did strike me that he could have read, a smattering of German, which I'm sure is better than my German, reads the first, section or so, and then submits a brief review. But anyway, that is an illustrative. It's not really well, I suppose it is a little bit of a bit of a joke at Keynes, a little bit of remark at Keynes' expense, but it's really what I want to focus on is the fact that a lot of these German writers, right, were just not discussed among English-speaking economists. And that means Brits and Americans, right, because they weren't translated into English and they didn't read German. I mean, a few did, but most of them didn't. Anyway, so that's the argument by Mises, and I'll be very brief now. Okay. All right. It is not now Hayek in his foreword to this mentions in passing how he himself was something of a socialist and was, I'm not keen on the word converted, but was persuaded that he was erroneous by studying under Mises, because he studied under Mises, the Mises Kreis in Vienna, and he also mentions Wilhelm Röpke. Right, and he mentions, where are we? Lionel Robbins, right? Lionel Robbins, the LSE. And Robbins is the one who gets Hayek to come to the LSE. And Robbins also acknowledges a debt to Mises in, say, his famous essay, an essay on the nature and significance of economic science. So there was a generation, or some of his generation, let's say, that were persuaded by the Misesian argument. And what I want to briefly do now, and I've already sort of alluded to it, is to recount the story as I know it of a handful of Marxists who were also persuaded by Mises' argument in the 1970s. David Ramsay Steele was a committed Marxist and socialist, but he was a member of a very small socialist group, very quite venerable history, formed in 1904, the Socialist Party of Great Britain. And if you go, you can find their website right now on the web, and you can read all about them. Right? They're still going. Right? They're very proud of the fact that they did not support. I think they're the only Marxist group that did not support either World War at all. Because as you can imagine, in the Second World War, once the Soviet Union got attacked by the Nazis, then the Soviet Union came in. Then, of course, they were in favour of fighting Hitler, right? Okay, and on the, given that this is the proper course for a communist supporter of the Soviet Union to do, is to support them on this matter. But the Socialist Party of Great Britain was always anti-war, and they never supported either war. Anyway, because they were sort of depicted as goody-goody, they were nicknamed by the left as a small party of good boys, Socialist Party of Great Britain. Right? And they were opposed to reformism, and they were advocates of class struggle, like any other good Marxist, but through the ballot box and Parliament, and that's the sense in which they were goody-goody, right? Okay? They were in favour of the ballot box and Parliament, and the point was they believed that you wouldn't achieve socialism until you had an intellectual renaissance, right? In other words, you actually persuade people of the merits of socialism as they see it, right? Now, David Ramsay Steele comes out of that tradition, which is the power of argument, and that you can't speed things up by in any way, that you've really ultimately got to convert people. And you convert the public intellectuals who then persuade other people, right? The Socialist Party of Great Britain put the emphasis on, winning elections and getting into Parliament and changing the way that the world worked that way. But it was part of a tradition of engagement, and certainly not one of violence, right? The most Marxist groups, in favour of the moment comes, you seize it and you man the barricades, right, and you're in there, right? Okay, or maybe you're in prison, but anyway, whatever it is, it's seizing the opportunity, and it's quite happy to use violence. The Socialist Party of Great Britain was totally opposed to violence in that sense, actually. And Steele reflected that. So I rather liked David when I met him at the Hull University Debating Society in the fall of 1969, when I went up to do a Masters in Monetary Economics. Anyway, I got talking, and another friend of ours there, Chris Taine, got talking to David Ramsay Steele. I suppose it was really more me who talked to him, because I was there in the Hull University Debating Society, and Chris Taine didn't really take part in the debates. But I talked to David and introduced him to libertarian arguments and Misesian arguments. And then in a letter of, I still have the letter, but it's in storage in England, so I couldn't consult it for this talk. I think it was a letter of January 1973, but I may be off. It may be 72, but I think it's 73. David wrote to me saying he had been persuaded by the Misesian argument. And as I said, he ditched his thesis on Marx's Capital to write a critique of Marx, or Marx's economic argument. It's a fabulous book. He does write really well. And then, as I said, later on he found that they would give him a PhD on the strength of the book. So he applied for it and filled the necessary paperwork and got a PhD from Hull University on the strength of it. Anyway, and friends of his, Marxist friends of his, became libertarians as well, who are friends of mine, on the strength of Mises' argument. And I was generous of Patrick to say this perhaps, Marx is the one who converted David to libertarianism, but I always say, no, I didn't. Because David, I introduced him to ideas, and this is surely all that we can ever expect when we engage with people. We introduce them to ideas, we leave the seed for them in their minds, they read it. I remember David saying to me, very, very early on, actually, soon after I met him in 69, saying to me that, when somebody puts a view that is opposed to yours, right, your initial reaction is, you don't expect the person to, after all, you're asking them to throw out their views that their views are. This is part of them, right? Okay? But what happens is, if the idea takes hold and they're interested, a little bit disturbed, there's something niggling there, they haven't quite answered, and David was a very intellectually honest person, so he was going to deal with this, right? So he'd come back and he'd ask a question, and so read Mises. I'd engage him in the arguments perhaps and things, and we went backwards and forwards. And one thing he said to me that you find that people do is this. He said, they don't say. They don't say. Okay, they don't want to say that they may be wrong, but they say, well, there was this friend of mine who said, and it's always like that, right? And so on. But eventually, if people are intellectually honest, you can change their views. But please, they are changing. They are choosing in the light of the material that you've read, you've lent them, and the arguments you've had with them, all to your credit. But they are ultimately the ones who choose to make that change in their minds, right? Okay, they change their views, and some of them do, and some of them don't. Okay, so anyway, what I would like to say is take ideas very seriously, and that surely should be. And Mises took ideas very seriously, after all, right? So let's have a toast to Mises. No?